An app disappearing from the App Store feels like a door slamming shut. You scroll past the listing, it says no longer available, and your brain files that undergone. Technically, that's rarely what's actually happened. The app you can't download anymore is just the front door closing. Everything that used to be behind that door, your account record, your photos, your location history, the messages you sent through it, is still sitting on somebody's servers. And it keeps sitting there until a specific, deliberate process removes it, or until nobody ever bothers to. I've spent a fair amount of time looking at what actually happens on the back end when apps and services wind down. Partly because it matters for my own work, and partly because the shutdown emails companies send out are almost always written to sound reassuring rather than to tell you what's really going on. So this isn't a scare piece, and it isn't a here's the one setting that fixes it piece, because there isn't one. It's a walk through the actual mechanics, so you know what you're dealing with next time an app you use closes its doors. The phrase "the app shut down" covers a huge range of outcomes, and the difference usually comes down to why the company closed, not just the fact that it did. Sometimes your data gets deleted cleanly on a schedule somebody actually built. Sometimes it sits untouched on a server nobody's paying attention to anymore. And sometimes it quietly changes hands to a completely different company that never asked you directly whether that was okay. All three get described with the exact same sentence in a push notification, which is part of the problem. The first thing worth understanding is that the app on your phone is almost never where your data actually lives. Most apps are what you'd call a thin client, meaning the screens and buttons you tap around are just a way of capturing and displaying information. The actual data, your profile, your history, whatever you uploaded, sits in a database somewhere else, on servers the company controls. When people say an app shut down, what usually happens first is that the client on your phone stops being maintained or gets pulled from the store. The backend is a separate decision, made on its own timeline. You can see this play out two different ways in practice. Sometimes an app vanishes from the App Store entirely, but if you already have it installed, the website still loads and your login still works for months afterward because the backend is still running even though nobody can newly download the client. Other times it goes the opposite way. The app icon is still sitting right there on your home screen, but every request just times out because the servers were switched off on a specific date, sometimes with no warning at all. Both get called a shutdown, and they leave your data in very different states. There's one case where this whole question barely matters, and that's when the app only ever used local storage, meaning notes or files that never actually left your device in the first place. If that's what you were using, a shutdown is mostly cosmetic. You lose future updates and support, sure, but the files that were already on your phone are still on your phone. The privacy question we're actually talking about here only starts once a server was involved somewhere in how the app worked. The next thing to get straight is that deletion is a policy decision, not something that happens automatically. There's a common assumption that when a service ends, the data ends with it, and that's just not how databases work by default. Deleting data is cheap in server terms. A company can absolutely run a job that wipes everything out. But a company that's shutting down is usually cash-strapped, short-staffed, and focused on other things entirely. Refunds, layoffs, the actual wind-down paperwork. Actually deleting user data on a defined schedule requires someone to build that process and someone to run it. If nobody prioritizes that, which happens more than you think, the servers often just get switched off, and the underlying storage gets left intact on whatever cloud provider was hosting it. Sometimes that sits there for years, until someone eventually stops paying the hosting bill, or the cloud provider reclaims the storage on its own schedule. Nobody made a decision to keep your data around forever. It's just that nobody made the opposite decision either. And inertia is a powerful force in a company that's winding down. Now, some companies do the right thing and publish a specific commitment in their shutdown notice. Something like, all user data will be permanently deleted within 30 days. When you see language that specific, it's worth taking seriously. But I want to be straight with you about the limits here. It's a policy statement, not something you or I can independently verify. There's no way to confirm from the outside that the database was actually purged, rather than just archived quietly somewhere. The only real leverage you have as a user is in what happened before that shutdown notice ever went out. And the meaningful amount of your data has usually already left the company's own servers by the time you hear the words, "We are shutting down." Most apps embed third-party tools for analytics, crash reporting, advertising, and push notifications, and those tools typically phone home to their own separate vendors, independently of the app's core backend. Your device identifiers, your rough location, your usage patterns, sometimes even contact details, may already be sitting in an analytics vendor's warehouse, an ad network's profile store, or a crash reporting tool's logs. None of that gets touched by the original app shutting down, because it was never stored there to begin with. This is the part that fear-selling headlines tend to skip completely. And it's also not something a company can fix by handling your data responsibly on the way out. The app closing doesn't recall data that already got exported to a dozen third-party pipelines while the app was live and working normally. If you want an actual sense of how much left and who it went to, the app's own privacy policy, from back when it was still active, usually lists the categories of third parties it shared data with. That's a far better signal than anything you'll find in the shutdown announcement itself. A large share of what gets called a shutdown is actually an acquisition, where one company folds a product into another, or a competitor simply buys the user base rather than the software itself. The app you knew disappears, but the account database is usually the single most valuable asset being acquired, arguably more valuable than the code itself. The terms of service you agreed to almost always include a clause allowing your data to transfer to a successor entity in the event of a merger or acquisition, which means the shutdown notice is really functioning as advance notice of a transfer, not a deletion event. So if you see a shutdown announcement that also mentions your account being migrated to a partner service, or one that invites you to continue on some related platform, that's exactly this scenario playing out in front of you. Your data isn't gone, it's moved to a new controller, with in principle a new privacy policy now governing it, even though nobody ever asked you again for consent along the way, and you probably never even noticed the handoff happening. The harder case, and the one worth taking most seriously, is a company that shuts down through bankruptcy rather than an orderly wind down or a clean acquisition. In bankruptcy proceedings, a user database is treated as an asset like anything else the company owns: office equipment, inventory, intellectual property, and it can legally be sold off to satisfy creditors. Sometimes that buyer has no connection at all to the original product and no obligation to honor the original privacy policy you agreed to when you signed up. This has happened often enough with failed retailers and with apps that some regulators now specifically scrutinize data sales during bankruptcy, sometimes appointing an independent reviewer to check whether the sale is actually consistent with what users were originally promised. That review process exists precisely because the default outcome, your data being sold off as a line item with no promises attached, is a real and documented risk, not some hypothetical worst case someone made up for a headline. None of this means every bankrupt app's data ends up in the hands of a stranger. I want to be clear about that. What it means is that once a company files for bankruptcy, the incentives that would otherwise lead to a deliberate deletion process, habit, goodwill, a privacy team that still exists and still cares, are mostly gone. At the exact same time, the incentive to extract value out of whatever assets are left, including the data, is at its highest point. So what can you actually do with all of this? You can't force a company to delete data it's already decided not to delete. And there's no tool, no setting, no clever trick that reaches into someone else's backup and erases a copy that already exists there. What you can do is act while the app is still live, and while a request from you still goes somewhere with someone able to act on it. The single most useful thing is to export or delete proactively the moment you see a shutdown notice land in your inbox. Most of those emails include a specific window, often somewhere between 30 and 90 days, to request an export of your data, or a full account deletion before the servers actually go dark for good. That window is the only point in this whole process where a request from you reliably reaches a system still capable of acting on it. So treat it as a deadline, not a suggestion. It's also worth actually reading what the notice says about a successor or an acquirer, rather than skimming straight past that part to get to the unsubscribe link. If your account is being transferred rather than deleted, you are, by default, now consenting to a new company's data practices, unless you specifically opt out or delete your account before the migration date listed in that same email. Another thing worth doing, and one people almost always forget, is revoking connected app permissions separately from deleting the app itself. If you signed in using your Google account, your Apple account, or Facebook, or if you granted the app access to your contacts, your calendar, or your photos at some point, deleting the app off your phone does not revoke any of that access on its own. You need to go into your account's connected app settings on Google, Apple, or Facebook directly, find the app in that list, and remove it by hand. Scan the enter. Deleting your account after the fact doesn't recall the analytics data or the ad targeting data that was already shared while you were actively using the app, month after month. If that's a real concern for you, the app's old privacy policy is genuinely more useful after the fact than any request you could send to the company that's shutting down, because it tells you which categories of data went where while things were still running. None of this adds up to a guarantee, and I'm not going to pretend it does. There's no single step and no single tool that makes your account data fully accounted for once a company stops existing in any meaningful way. The realistic goal here is reducing what's left exposed and understanding which of these outcomes, clean deletion, quiet inaction, acquisition, or bankruptcy, you're actually dealing with, instead of just assuming that shutdown automatically means gone. If you want to go deeper than any of this, that's basically what the channel and the site are for. 2 test and step-by-step guides that tell you plainly what the thing actually protects you from, and just as importantly, what it doesn't. The full guides and 2 tests are at theprivacywire.com, so go take a look, and if this was useful, subscribe for more of these.